It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Steve.
Dave Feldman is actually traveling today, so he won't be joining us, but we still have a stellar show. Our guest today is attorney Martin Garbus. Now, Martin Garbus is one of America's legendary trial lawyers. He specializes in First Amendment issues and fighting the arbitrary or wrongful exercise of power, especially by governments. In the past, he's either represented or been associated with historical figures such as Daniel Ellsberg, Cesar Chavez, and Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov. He's here today to tell us the story of a miscarriage of justice, who for our regular listeners might contain echoes of the story told by Israeli dissident Miko Peled, who talked to us about the railroading of a group of Arab Americans known as the Holy Land Five. Well, Mr. Garbus tells the story of another miscarriage of American justice that also involves 5 victims. These 5 happen to be from Cuba. The book is entitled North of Havana, The Untold Story of Dirty Politics, Secret Diplomacy, and the Trial of the Cuban Five. One reviewer called it, quote, a revealing tale of politicized justice, inhuman prisons, and backdoor diplomacy. And as always, we will find time to squeeze in a corporate crime report from our fearless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhyber, and then answer some listener questions. But first, let's hear the untold story of dirty politics and secret diplomacy. Martin Garbus is an attorney who is expert at every level of civil and criminal trial and litigation. He has appeared before the United States Supreme Court in leading First Amendment cases and is the author of Tough Talk, How I Fought for Writers, Comics, Bigots, and the American Way. And the book we're going to talk about today, North of Havana, The Untold Story of Dirty Politics, Secret Diplomacy, and the Trial of the Cuban Five. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Martin Garbus.
Thank you very much.
Welcome indeed. You've been through a lot over your many decades as a lawyer for often unpopular causes or powerless causes.
So have you.
I saw in your book, this really surprised me. I mean, it's not surprising that you were roughed up in some of the cases where just going to court with crowds screaming at you. As you said, in the farmlands of Delano, California, while representing Cesar Chavez, the great leader who organized farm workers, you said you were beaten, jailed, held, and threatened with contempt. Those are your words. So let's get to the Cuban Five. It's actually not that complicated a struggle, and I don't want our listeners to think it's too complicated for them to follow, but it was in the context of years in the 1990s and before of efforts by people in this country to overthrow Fidel Castro, to sabotage his regime. And then something happened in 1998. Do you want to start it there, or you can start it anywhere you want, just to explain the parties here before we get into the details?
Okay, basically, Castro and Clinton agreed that they should not let the Cuban right wing create a provocation down in Miami that might lead to people getting hurt, planes or soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. So through Garcia Gable Marquez, Castro and Clinton exchanged words where they indicated they would try and limit the activities of the Cuban right wing as they used Miami as a base to go to Cuba and kill people, blow up buildings, et cetera, et cetera. The relationship worked for a while. Clinton said that he had the ability to stop the Cuban right wing from doing it, from taking off planes or going off in boats. As we all know, Miami is a separate city-state, and Clinton did not have the control that he thought. So the anti-Cuban activities with deaths and bombings continued. Ultimately, there was a group called Brothers to the Rescue who flew planes over Cuba. They invaded Cuban airspace, and they were not allowed to do that. Clinton tried to stop it. Clinton revoked the licenses of the people who were flying. Nonetheless, they continued to fly. Then what causes this case is 3 planes flew, brothers to the rescue, Cuban right wingers, flew over Cuba. They indicated they're going to go into the Cuban airspace. Both the Cuban and the American government told them not to do that. They did that. 2 MiGs shot down American planes. 4 people were killed. There's then a murder case. I was involved in that murder case. They alleged that some of the Cubans who were then working with the FBI to infiltrate the Cuban right wing were guilty of the crimes. And that was the trial. Gerardo Hernandez was charged with conspiracy to murder. It's hard to imagine as you tell the story, and I've told the story beyond the books, is the extent of cooperation that there was between the Americans in Miami and the Cubans in an attempt to stop the Cuban right wing. I think there are, as you look at the case, it kind of moves at 3 levels. It moves at the level at the case itself. Then it moves at the level of the politics of Florida. Ultimately, an indictment is brought against these guys. My client in May of 1999. That's the warm-up to Bush against Gore. Then you have the Bush against Gore election. Florida, more or less, gives the election over to Bush. And what the book also talks about is the years since then and the constant attempt by the Republicans, to whom Florida is essential if they're going to win a presidential election, to Trump, whom Florida is essential if he's going to win an election, the attempt to cultivate the right-wing Cuban vote.
Let's back up. We're talking with Martin Garbus, author of the new book, North of Havana, The Untold Story of Dirty Politics, Secret Diplomacy, and the Trial of the Cuban Five. Let's back up in just 2 ways, Martin. On October 6, 1976, as you relate on page 41, and I'm going to read this, quote, on October 6, 1976, a Cuban plane, Cubana Flight 455, took off from Barbados and headed toward Havana, carrying 73 people, including 24 fencers from the Cuban youth team that had just triumphed in the Central American Championships. Flight 455 blew up midair off the coast of Barbados. Those arrested for the crime told the police it was Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles, an exiled Cuban militant and former CIA operative who had planned the destruction of the aircraft, end quote. Well, was that ever verified? Was there an official report on who sabotaged that plane with a bomb in midair?
Yes, I think it's very clear that it was those 2 people, Bosch and Carriles. And one of the things in the book is, although that was in 76, and the incident I'm talking about in the book is 20 years later, Bosch is still a very, very powerful figure. And Bosch is one of the people who's still operating 20 years later with all the CIA knew who he was, the CIA worked with him. And there was another man named Jorge Mascanosa who was the suit, the money. And I just came back from Miami a little while ago. There's a Jorge Mascanosa Boulevard there. So Canosa, Bosch, Carriles were terrorists. And ultimately, Bosch was never convicted of this crime, nor was Carriles. So that you had the same people functioning there for 20, 30 years, and you had the attempt of Clinton working with Castro to try and stop incidents like that October 6, 1976 bombing, which killed 73 people.
Well, what happened was Castro, after taking all these incidents and attempts to sabotage his regime, etc., he finally created something he called a WASP network, and he sent 5 spies, Cubans, to Florida to try to infiltrate the anti-Castro movement and report back to Cuban intelligence whether there was going to be another assault, another bomb, another attack, or whatever. And those are your clients. Those 5 men are your clients. Now, they were, before you became their lawyer, they were convicted in a federal district court and the appeal in the circuit court en banc, that is, it failed. The 3 circuit court judges wanted to reverse the conviction because they thought it was not a fair trial. And so the government took it up to the full Circuit Court of Appeals, who said, yeah, it's okay. And they went to prison. And a number of lawyers represented them. And in 2002, was it? You took over as the advocate. And so what proceeded from there?
Well, ultimately, in December of 2014, I'm really going over a lot of years, you have the rapprochement with Raul Castro and Barack Obama. And one of the things that the Cubans insisted on was the release of the jailed men. My clients had had a horrific time in jail, 16 years, a third of it in solitary. You and I both know that the image of solitary as just a room without light or is only 1/10 of the story. What they can do to people in solitary can be horrific. And these guys, Cuban alleged killers of American heroes, got the worst of the American prison system. And that is discussed. That's the period from, let's say, 2002 to 2014. So Cuba had always insisted that these guys were innocent and they wanted them returned. When I got into the case, and it continued, the possibilities of them ever being returned was zero, except what happened was Alan Gross, an American CIA USAID spy, was arrested in Havana, and another American spy had been arrested previously. So as the rapprochement talk was going on and as the publicity was going on, there were also these negotiations that I was involved in to get my clients released from the American jail, go back to Cuba, and America wanted to get Alan Gross back. On December 2014, when there's the rapprochement, you saw Raul was on TV, Barack was on TV, but rather more quietly, my guys got off in Havana, having been released from jail, and Alan Gross was returned to Washington. So the book deals with the trials, it deals with the legal stuff, and then it deals at the end with Trump's attempts to make sure that the Cuban vote would always be his. At the time of the Bush against Gore election, the right wing in Miami posted big signs saying, we have remembered, and they gave the names of the 4 people here, as well as a young man, Elian Gonzalez, which is a related but different story. So it's very clear that it played a very large role in Bush against Gore. The other thing I should say is 3 prosecutors refused to indict these guys. Ultimately, a Reagan appointee comes in. He indicts these guys in 1999, right before Bush against Gore. And what the book then details also is the attempts of Trump over the years. The book ends a period of time ago, but certainly a lot has happened. Trump's attempt to strangle Cuba and the vote getting
Yes.
that helps him with.
And he did that by restricting Americans from traveling to Cuba, by restricting trade with Cuba that American farmers wanted very strongly to have, exporting food products, etc. But you said you wrote this book for more than one reason, not only to defend your clients, but you said, I'm going to quote you, quote, the best reason for telling the story about an event that occurred 2 decades ago and was after struggle and hardship successfully resolved is the important lessons that it offers to us. For one thing, it shows how our government can subvert the press and interfere with our jury system. It chronicles an unprecedented pollution of the American legal system in order to advance a political cause. For another, and this may be the real takeaway for us now, it reminds us that facts matter and truth matters, and that when people believe that get involved, there are no hopeless causes. In fact, sometimes the innocent guys, after paying an awful price, win, end quote. And in the book, you mentioned that our government actually paid reporters to fabricate op-ed pieces in Florida newspapers. Can you elaborate that?
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways in the book. We hear the word fake news. There was fake news long before Donald Trump came around. And in this particular case, the federal government, in order to get the jury influenced that was going to try the Cuban Five, spent vast sums of money. One of the things you had down there was Radio Marti. That was $15 million a year. That was under the control of this man, Canosa. There's never been a full accounting about how much of that money was devoted to CBS, NBC, and other newscasters. We do know that the Miami Herald, a very fine newspaper, in 2006, long after the trial, long after the conviction, learned that the people who were writing about the case itself received large sums of money from the American government. One journalist in 1 year received $280,000. So what you had is extraordinary sums of money being paid to the media so that the jury would be extraordinarily influenced by all of the false stories. There were stories about Castro giving hallucinogenics to people, false stories about what some of these defendants said. So the massive amount of money, and it got beyond the Miami Herald, it got to the local news stations. For example, one of the things the judge tried to do was to make sure the juries would be protected from the community. So what the media did is they would follow the jurors out during the day. They photographed them getting into their cars. They'd have their license plates. So within a very short time, the judge, a decent judge, it was her first criminal case. She could in no way cope with either the legal issues or the politics of the case. Within a few days, everybody in the community knew who these jurors were. And the motions for change of venue failed, although certain judges, as you kind of summarized, felt that the conviction should be reversed because of it. But the massive amount of money used to influence the jury, it is unprecedented in America that kind of money was used. And we all know that that kind of money is available tomorrow to anybody who wants to use it to also, in a way, this was a precursor. I mean, this stuff has happened before, but never on this enormous scale because there was so much at stake.
Let's ask a question that our more skeptical listeners might be asking right now. Apart from 3 federal judges overruled by their colleagues, saying that they did not get a fair trial, that the atmosphere for any kind of fair jury trial in South Florida against anybody who was working for the Castro regime was, to put it mildly, prejudicial. Now,
Right.
suppose our listeners are asking you, Martin Garbus, 2 questions. These Cuban Five were acknowledged spies. They were sent
Yes.
on an espionage mission from Castro's Cuba to infiltrate what they saw as ongoing, year after year, violent anti-Castro actions using bombs and other weapons. So 2 questions. 1, how did they get into this country legally? This is the Cuban Five led by Gerardo Hernandez. And second, why did you think they were innocent? They were on an espionage mission.
Well, 2 things. It's hard to understand, and I've spoken to experts and all that stuff, exactly the whole question of the exchange of information of the FBI and Cuban spies. For a lot of people, it's hard to accept. But the fact is that both Clinton and Castro wanted it to happen. There were meetings where the FBI went to Havana during the Clinton period, where information was exchanged between the Cuban Five, the Cuban intelligence information, and the FBI with respect to these Cuban spies. That is very difficult for many people to accept, but it happened. It happened because Castro and Cuba both did not want to see planes blown out of the air, as you said before, and they wanted to tamp down the Cuban militancy. Now, the next question you've asked is, you have these Cuban spies. How can you be sure that they were not involved in the shoot down or should not have been charged with conspiracy to murder. There are two things. One is a story that I knew when I wrote the book, and the other is something I did not know at all, which I'll now share for the first time. The Cuban spies were low-level people. These guys did not have the authority to authorize MiGs over Havana to shoot down American planes. And nor did they know of the right-wing planes that were flying that day. So factually, there was no way that these people were in any way responsible. They were low-level troops. To blow 3 planes out of the air and kill them, to send up MiGs, to then shoot down planes, it's beyond something they could do.
People should know that these were not passenger planes like American Airlines. They were Cessna small planes hired by anti-Castro operatives to invade Cuban airspace and try to get the U.S. involved in another imbroglio with Cuba, the way President Kennedy got involved, to his later regret, in the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Exactly. And what they would do when the planes were there, the Cessnas, 2 people in a plane, 3 Cessnas, they would radio down to Cuba, look, we can pierce Castro's air defenses. You can arise, and you can overthrow the government. If we can do this, you can do that. They dropped leaflets all over the place. They tried to drop bombs. The bombs never got beyond the water. And in fact, one of the times, one of the planes ran out of gas. They landed in Havana. Castro gave them gas, and they came back. So that's what they were doing. And these were people, as you say, not American Airlines. No, they were right-wing Cubans who were trying to cause a provocation. Now, there were 3 planes. Basulto is the leader of the operation. He takes the 3 planes over Cuba. He sees the MiGs coming. He turns around. He leaves the other 2 guys there. They're far deeper into Cuba. The other 2 guys the other 2 planes with 4 people get shot down and get killed. Basulto, and you can hear it on the radio, is delirious in a way with happiness. He has done it. He has caused the provocation. The other story I wanted to tell you, it was told to me by Rose Styron, and it's a very moving story.
The novelist William Styron, yes.
Wife of the novelist, that they had been invited to Cuba after the Bush against Gore election. And Castro, and in the room was Arthur Schlesinger, Arthur Miller, and other people. It was a literary event in Havana, and it would seem that the event was set up so that Castro could then meet with these people. And the stories about that evening are quite wonderful. But one of the things that Castro says, he says, Herodotus, the great Greek historian, said that every great leader makes one foolish mistake. And Castro said, I made a mistake. He said, I made a mistake in ordering the shoot down. And that's because he had Clinton there, and there was a possibility that under Clinton, that things would have got remarkably different with Castro. And that event, as a result of the shoot down, that possibility was lost forever. And secondly, whether you say the shoot down or other events, irrevocably drove Florida into the Republican line for presidential elections. And they're still trying to dig out from it. But every election, the killing of those men comes up, and it's an extraordinary rallying cry for the Cuban right wing. So it's something that we live with even today. You mentioned some of the things that Trump has done. I met about 10 days ago with the representatives of the Cuban government, high levels, without giving names, of the Cuban government. And what they were saying was the extent to which Trump, throughout the world, and his party, has affected the Cubans' ability to do business with anybody, anywhere. That their ability to go through banks has been limited. So it's not just, the flights aren't there, or, they've also created a series of lawsuits now whereby, under American law, allegedly, if your property was taken away in '59 by Castro, you can now file a lawsuit in Miami, and you can try and get back the assets that you lost in '59. This is an attempt, in a way, to get the younger Cubans who are not as militant against Castro, in fact, are more conciliatory with Castro, to have a vested interest in winning these lawsuits so they get some money for it. It's a brilliant thing on behalf of Trump to try and erode the younger Cuban support for Castro.
When I had a long interview with Fidel Castro in Cuba in 2002, it was just a few weeks after John Bolton in the State Department, without the authorization of Secretary of State Colin Powell, who despises Bolton, emitted a bald lie. He said Castro's regime was developing biological and chemical warfare. Well,
Right.
that's like totally freaked out Castro because he saw it coming. Oh, here we go again, a pretext for an attack on Cuba. So he was not
Right.
paranoid at all about decade after decade, the U.S. government directly and indirectly trying to overthrow him. But on the back of your book, there's a statement by longtime Harvard law professor Charles Nesson talking about your book. And he says, quote, "This haunting story of Cuba-U.S. relationships takes us into the deepest parts of today's American security system and exposes our pseudo-legal judicial process. Today, more than ever, every American must hear what Martin Garbus says," end quote. Well, this is not an outlier case. All over the United States, there is lawlessness among runaway prosecutors. There is lawlessness among giant corporations engaging in corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. And as I noted in an essay for Lapham's Quarterly, lawlessness has become the norm by the rich and powerful and the politically entrenched. What's your broader view on this, Martin? So people don't think this is a exceptional situation.
At the end of my book, I say, talking about this case, that this is part of my life, quote, hate to quote myself, working in the lawless, dark world of the law. I think that what you were aware of at the very beginning of your career, which we are all now much more aware of, is the lawlessness of the legal system. One of the things that I fought for a great deal and lost, I tried in the 80s and 90s to get, let's say, the left involved in the fight over judgeships. And by and large, that was a total failure. Federalists won, the conservatives won, liberals still held on to the view of the legal system as one that administers a great deal of justice. The right wing was far, far smarter, and they spent a good deal of time and money in making sure of the people who would ultimately be sitting in judgments on these cases. The judge who ultimately was the definitive judge in this case was a man named Pryor. And before he was appointed to the circuit, he said, the worst abomination in the history of constitutional law was Roe against Wade. I will never forget January 22nd, 1973, the day 7 members of our highest court ripped the Constitution and ripped the life out of millions of unborn children. Second worst decision, he said, was Miranda. This was the judge ultimately appointed by Bush, who was the definitive judge in this particular case. I mean, I think you and I would both agree that one of the great problems in the future is the extent to which the federal judiciary today and tomorrow will be wholly owned by the Republican Party.
And that note, just a contemporary issue here, Bruce Fine and I just sent a letter to the American Bar Association. And we said, where are you on the most impeachable president in American history, Donald Trump? In 2005, 2006, the American Bar Association, with 500,000 lawyers being members, was run by a corporate lawyer, Michael Greco. And look at the courageous thing he did. He assembled 3 task forces to study 3 impeachable offenses by George W. Bush, and he sent the reports to Bush and Cheney in the White House. Now we have an even more impeachable president, except nothing can compare with the criminal war of aggression against Iraq and Libya under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Undeclared wars, unappropriated, unauthorized funding for the Libyan overthrow, and an undeclared war that has killed over 1 million Iraqis, millions of refugees, and thousands of American soldiers by Bush and Cheney starting in March 2003. But apart from that, the ABA has been silent. The lawyers of America, with few exceptions, have been silent on contempt of Congress by Trump, sexual predator, Trump, serial fabricator and liar about matters of state and matters of grave importance by Trump, appropriating funds without congressional authority by Trump, illegal warring overseas by Trump, and taking from Alexander Hamilton's explanation of high crimes and misdemeanors being abuse of the public trust, huge abuse of the public trust.
Ralph, you failed to mention Mr. Barr.
And the same thing, with his attorney general, who instead of being an attorney general of the United States, he behaves like the lawless lawyer for Donald J. Trump. So I have never seen a crisis of lawlessness so deep and so pervasive, from the corporate to the prosecutorial criminal injustice system in our jails, prisons, to the raw, consistent institutionalized violation by a runaway president under both parties, not to mention the abdication of constitutional duty by the U.S. Congress, who has in effect made this American-style monarchical office in the White House possible. Can we get your views on that?
Well, you said it far more eloquently than I could. I think that there may come a time when America may get disabused of the idea that the legal system can protect against any of these things. I think the horrendous activities, and you and I both don't know yet the full extent of Trump's foreign policy and exactly what it's going to lead to in the various places in the world. I mean, we got a little sense that we already knew at this latest meeting in London when we hear all the remarks that he makes about this totally transactional president. I mean, I agree totally with what you said, and I could not say it any better than you said it.
And I just realized I left out self-enrichment, violation of the Emoluments Clause. No other president has done such egregious violations in so many of these areas. I mean, most presidents put their assets in a blind trust and never talk about it and don't even know what's going on. He owns these hotels. He has refused to sever his relationship of ownership, even to give ownership to his family, because he's so greedy. And he promotes his properties in Florida to foreign leaders for meetings, and his golf course in Scotland, and his Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue here. So we have a problem with the impeachment proceedings in Congress not going forward with a full, strong hand. If the Democrats just keep it to the Ukraine issue and a general obstruction of justice, they have told the American people they're interested in impeachment, not in removal in the Senate, because those two are not going to move the Republicans in the Senate.
I totally agree with you. It seems to me that the cases that are now pending, both in the circuit courts and, on their way to the Supreme Court, which deal with money, whether it be Deutsche Bank or whether his accountants, it seems to me that certainly should be pursued, because I think you and I both, well, certainly I feel that the impeachment proceeding today, as it's going ahead, is a loser in the Senate, and I think you and I both are, as incomprehensible as Trump is, it's easy to see him as an aberration. But then you look at the rest of the Republican Party, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, Lindsey Graham, McConnell. It's not just Trump, as we both understand. It's the entire corruption of the American political system.
And the press is playing along and getting ratings because of Trump's outrages, and he knows it.
Right.
He taunts them. He says, you can't not cover me day after day because I'm good for your business. The book is North of Havana by Martin Garbus, who has represented so many clients so courageously, testing the rule of law, testing due process of law in the United States. And this book is the untold story of dirty politics, secret diplomacy, and the trial of the Cuban Five. The Cuban Five are now back in Cuba, living normal lives as a result of a arrangement between Barack Obama and the Castro regime in 2014. Has Hollywood shown any interest in this case of great intrigue?
There's a film called The Wasp Network, which was made by Oliver Assayas, and I find it to be a wonderful film. It opened in Cannes, and as a matter of fact, this coming weekend, December 14th, is the 5th anniversary of the Cuban Five being released, and this film is being shown in Havana this Saturday night. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. I think it's going on Netflix. It doesn't have an American distributor. It's a very sympathetic portrayal. What it does is it shows the Cuban Five landing here, doing what they're doing, and then being arrested. It doesn't deal with the trial. It deals with what these men sacrificed. It's got Penelope Cruz, other people in it. It's a wonderful movie, I think. And I guess it'll be shown in the United States next year.
Well, Steve, do you have any questions as we close?
No, actually. My question that I was ready to ask was about, where they are now, and you've just answered that. So
Cuban Five is all in Havana. Gerardo is the vice rector of the school that he went to school as. They all are significant. If you look in the book or elsewhere, to go to prison and not get infractions is impossible. You can go to prison for 10 minutes, and if you look the wrong way, these guys, all of them, were in prison and never got an infraction. In other words, they were so self-controlled, so disciplined, that story itself is a remarkable story of what these guys went through in prison and how they kept their lives together.
One backup I have to clarify. Didn't Alan Gross deny that he was a CIA operative in Cuba?
Well, two things. First of all, he denied it. And then he tried to, through various groups, put pressure on the American government to get him out. The American government failed to do it. He then sued the American government. And he claimed in that lawsuit that I have been USAID, CIA, you left me here, you didn't tell me about all the dangers, you didn't tell me. So he had a lawsuit against the United States government, which he got a substantial settlement for. So, yes, you had the original denial. He then says, I was that person, you sent me down here, and you didn't protect me. Something like that has never happened before.
You're saying in his legal complaint against the U.S. government, he admitted he not only worked for USAID, but he had worked for the CIA?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Martin. This is very good.
Thank you, Ralph.
When the book came out, did you get an interview on NPR or PBS or any media?
No.
I always ask that question of our authors. So our listeners realize that they're not getting the full story, even on public broadcast media.
No. I think the interest in Cuba has been close to zero the last 4 months. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, there's another question of the international law violation of sanctions whose brunt comes in on innocent civilians in the targeted country.
In Cuba, after Russia pulled out, was in desperate economic situation. Right now, what America is doing is effectively strangling the Cuban people. They don't have fuel for the winter coming up. They have cut off any banking resources. Other countries and corporations, for example, something like Marriott, if they were to continue to do the hotel business there, they would face action by the United States. So the United States has created this extraordinary web aimed at strangling the people of Cuba. It's a terrible story.
It's also a violation of international law. International law says you can apply sanctions, say, to a military dictatorship, and if it affects the civilians, it's got to do so with minimal effect as a
Right.
side effect, but this is huge effect
Yeah, this is beyond
on
testing.
civilians in Cuba.
Yes, this is going at individual people who do business with Cuba, making it impossible, but because the American government will impose penalties on the Marriotts or anybody else who tries to keep Cuba alive. There has rarely been a strangulation like this, certainly never by America. It was not like this even under Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera.
Including export of food, medicine, medical
Yes.
equipment, and other necessities of life. Well,
Yes.
thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Martin Garbus. We will link to his work at ralphnativeradiohour.com. When we come back, Ralph is going to answer some listener questions. But first, let's find out what's going on in the shadowy world of corporate criminality with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, December 6, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. New Jersey has demanded that Uber pay $649 million for years of unpaid employment taxes for its drivers, arguing that the ride-hailing company has misclassified the workers as independent contractors and not as employees. The State's Department of Labor and Workforce Development issued the request this week to Uber and a subsidiary, Razor, after an audit uncovered $530 million in back taxes that had not been paid for unemployment and disability insurance from 2014 to 2018. Because of the non-payment, the state is seeking another $110 million in interest. That's according to a report in the New York Times. The case represents the first time that a local government has sought back taxes from Uber, which has hundreds of thousands of drivers in the United States. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Let's do some listener questions. This first one comes from Larry Kennemore, and he says he's referring to our show about drinking water with Seth Siegel. He says, great program you had on drinking water. However, you only touched on the problem. We have researched drinking water for the last 10 years and tested drinking water ourselves in numerous municipalities. There are more problems with pharmaceuticals, which are not regulated at all, he says, in the drinking water than the subject you talked about. You are drinking a cocktail of pharmaceuticals in every glass of drinking water. And there's some reference here to Stat Medicament Disposal Corporation. So what do you say to that?
Well, it's probably one of the private testing companies that people can go to, supplying with local drinking water. Well, that's a nightmare scenario. Hospitals are trying to do something about a problem that they have been ignoring for years. It's flushing medicines down the toilet or down the sink. And of course, a lot of people get rid of their pills that they're not using and other medications down the sink. And if it goes into a river or a lake that is the source of drinking water for the municipality's technology, by and large, is geared to dealing with bacteria and dealing with heavy metals like cadmium, arsenic, and lead, and not really able to deal with medication residues. So this is a problem that a lot of drinking water safety administrators don't like to talk about, just because it's so scary and so alarming. And it's something we have to face up to. Now, I think the questioner overgeneralized. Obviously, if you have drinking water from deep wells, you're not likely to get pharmaceutical residue in these water systems. But it is a really serious problem.
Yeah, I have a bottle of blood pressure pills, I think valsartan ones or losartan ones, which were taken off the market for being tainted. And it's still sitting in my medicine cabinet because I don't know where to take it. And I don't want to just throw it in the garbage or flush it down. What would you advise people who have pills themselves that are no longer useful or they're no longer using? How do they get rid of those?
Well, there are municipalities who have periodic collections. Like on Saturday, you can bring your medicines to X location, and presumably they know how to dispose of these medicines in a safe manner. I don't have a website to give people, but I'm sure you can Google the right words and find out whether they have such a disposal program periodically for people to take their haul of unused medicines to.
Well, very good. Thank you for that, Larry. Our next question comes from Neil Harris, and the subject is progressives appearing on right-wing media. It says, Dear Mr. Nader, I would like to hear your thoughts on progressives and leftists appearing on right-wing media. Do you think leftists lend legitimacy to the right by appearing on these shows, especially shows like Tucker Carlson, which go beyond normal conservatism and into white nationalism? Carlson uses very dangerous rhetoric against immigrants and the homeless. For example, he says Glenn Greenwald, Tulsi Gabbard, Michael Tracy, and others appear on Carlson's show fairly frequently. Carlson does actually let his guests speak without interruption for the most part, however. And he's also like to know your thoughts on the progressives having articles posted on sites like Un's Review, which carries literal neo-Nazis. What are the ethics and morals of this, he asks. He says, I know this is pretty complicated for a brief answer on your show, but I've always looked to Mr. Nader for moral clarity. And he's also, I'll just add this. He says, lastly, I'd like to thank Mr. Nader for his long, inspiring career of activism. I picked up his book, Crashing the Party, after the 2000 election, and it really changed the way I looked at the world.
Well, first of all, Neil, I believe that the answer to bad speech is more free speech. So I'm not a person who advocates censorship under the First Amendment. Second, I always like to go on right-wing shows because I want to persuade some right-wing viewers or listeners of proper policies. So obviously, if a leftist goes on Tucker Carlson's show and doesn't know how to argue very strongly on the person's behalf, that just strengthens Tucker Carlson's viewpoint. But if you feel that you can make a strong argument for your case, why not go on all these shows? It throws the host on the defensive if you have any kind of authenticity and conviction in what you're saying, and that's a good thing. So I never say to myself, I'm not going to go on this show or that show. With one exception, I will not go on shows where people overtalk, cut you off after 10 seconds, and do not allow you to have your say, whether they're liberal shows or they're right-wing shows.
Who in past has fit that category for you, Ralph?
The overtalk?
Yeah.
Well, it happens sometimes when you go on, for example, Neil Cavuto's show on Fox Cable. It's such a short show. To begin with, they tell you got 4 minutes on the show, the whole segment.
Right.
And he cuts in because it's not a 30-minute or 20-minute program. I give him some leeway there, and I often say, Neil, let me finish, will you? I'm the person being interviewed, not you.
Right. All right. Well, very good. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Tim Wolf. He says, Dear Mr. Nader, the main thing that triggered the Trump impeachment is that he delayed aid to Ukraine until they provided negative feedback on Biden and his son. Is that really more impeachable than Bush and Cheney war crimes or the impeachable offenses of Obama, assassination of American citizens, drone strikes, invasions of Libya, etc.? Or is just that Trump is indirectly attacking American citizens? Well, Bush and Obama were directly killing non-American citizens. There's no reason why our American political preferences should be more sacred than the lives of innocent civilians outside of our political sphere.
You make a good point. I mean, the most impeachable offense is a criminal war of aggression. Bush Cheney, Exhibit 1. However, remember, Obama unleashed all kinds of violence, nothing like Bush and Cheney, drones here and there, killing civilians, and Trump is doing the same thing. So what Trump is doing in terms of illegal, unconstitutional warfare day after day in 10 countries, Somalia and Syria and Afghanistan and Yemen and so forth, are, in my judgment, more impeachable offenses than what he did on the Ukraine situation.
And you believe, as we've talked about before, and we did a whole special impeachment podcast on this that the listeners should take a look at, that all of these impeachable offenses should be brought forward, but the conventional wisdom is saying that you've got to keep it simple for people. And it looks like there may be no more than 3 at most articles of impeachment, all dealing with the Ukraine situation, the bribery, the obstruction and possibly contempt of Congress. But isn't there some efficacy to that argument that you want to keep it simple?
No, it's not a matter of simple or complex. It's a matter of unconstitutional behavior and the duty of the House and Senate to abide by the Constitution in its impeachment provisions. The most important thing is when you go after a president, you don't just go after impeaching him and allow him to be acquitted and not removed in the Senate. If you're going to impeach him, you should also declare that you want him removed. And if you want him removed, you have to go with the fullest, strongest hand of impeachable offenses. For people to find out what I mean by that, go to nader.org. You will see 12 impeachable counts under one article of impeachment laid out, plus a letter with Bruce Fein that I sent explaining it to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
All right, very good. Our next question comes from Karen Riley. She wants to talk about the Boeing 787 discussion we had with whistleblower John Barnett. She says, "Dear Ralph, I listened in horror to your conversation with John Barnett. What a courageous guy." And then this morning, I saw the headline about the Philippine Air Boeing 777 in LA that had fire coming out of its engine. She wanted to reach out in the event you hadn't heard about it. Not sure if it's related to what John was talking about, but she's gravely concerned. And she's flown so much in her life, especially overseas. She no longer thinks she's willing to fly. And she wants to thank you for your podcast and all that you do.
Well, thank you very much, Karen Riley. John Barnett is now a private citizen. He's back in Louisiana. He's looking for a job. He's having a hard time because he was a courageous whistleblower at the Boeing 777 plant in North Charleston, South Carolina, where after 30 some years of much heralded quality control work for Boeing, he saw things that endangered passengers, things left in parts of the plane that might come back to produce an accident. So the case that you pointed out has not been investigated to completion. I'm sure it will be. But that's the kind of possibility that John Barnett pointed out could happen with the sloppy procedures and situations at the Boeing plant in South Carolina.
Yeah, and he said there's usually an 8 to 10 year window until something actually flares up and causes a disaster. And we're very close to that window. That was the scary part of that. This next question or comment comes from Majid Safai about Facebook. It says, "Dear Mr. Nader, I listen to your radio program every Sunday, which is informative." And he talks about the one he listened to where we were discussing Facebook and whether there is a competition for it. And he says the answer is yes. And he wants you to check out Faciet, FACIET.com, which is designed to compete with Facebook. And he said it was recently launched and he needs to spread the word around to get more members. Says the big difference with Facebook is that Faciet.com protects members' privacy and will not share their private information with anyone without first obtaining written consent of the member. So he's pitching this as an alternative to Facebook.
Well, I'm not qualified to comment on that. As our listeners knows, I still use an Underwood typewriter. I'm not online, but the intent behind what you're trying to do, I think, is widely supported by people who think Facebook has gotten too much power and it's basically a de facto monopoly. And it's telling people you have to take what we give you because you got nowhere to go. Well, it turns out that Wikipedia co-founder Jimmy Wales, Wales, has launched a rival to Facebook and Twitter that he hopes will combat clickbait and misleading headlines. WT:social, his new social networking site, allows users to share links to articles and discuss them in a Facebook-style news feed. Topics range from politics and technology to heavy metal and beekeeping. This company is completely separate from Wikipedia. So that's a partial attempt by Mr. Wales to provide some competition to Facebook. Eventually, the U.S. government is going to have to face up to Facebook's monopoly, its effect on elections, its so-called contoured news feed, and its invasion of privacy right down to 10-year-olds anywhere in the world. So thanks for opening it up, Majid.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest again, Martin Garbus. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted. Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump presidency, and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. So join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak with Mark Green. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and stay active. 2020 is a big year in American history.
You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.